They laughed the moment she stepped onto the firing line. The snobby shooters, decked out in brand new gear and flashing their expensive rifles, glanced at her worn jeans and plain jacket and barely tried to hide their smirks. Whispers floated across the range, soft chuckles and jokes at her expense, but Rebecca Porter paid them no mind. She was used to being underestimated. This wasn't new to her. With calm and steady hands, she shouldered her rifle and got ready to fire. The moment she took aim, an unexpected silence fell over the crowd. No one could believe what happened next. A single perfect shot that changed everything. It was early morning when the sun poured its warm light through the curtains of Rebecca's modest farmhouse kitchen. She sat at the old wooden table, nursing her coffee, surrounded by photographs of her family. Generations of Porters stood proud in their hunting gear, rifles in hand, game displayed with respect on their walls. There was her grandfather, her father, and 3 brothers, all captured in moments of quiet strength and skill. Rebecca appeared in just as many photos as they did, though she had never been one for show. At 35, her hands told the real story, calloused and worn from years of hard work on the land. Her face, though striking, carried a natural beauty, untouched by makeup or fancy products. Her chestnut hair was pulled back into a practical ponytail, with a few loose strands framing her determined face. Her phone buzzed, and it was her father calling. His voice was warm, but edged with concern. "You sure about this, Becky?" he asked, his voice crackling through the speaker as she pressed the phone between her shoulder and ear. Rebecca smiled softly. "Dad, I've been shooting since I was 8 years old," she answered, steady and confident. She knew her worth, even if she didn't shout it from the rooftops. "I know, sweetheart," her father replied. "You're better than all of us put together. But those competition folks, they can be mighty unwelcoming to newcomers, especially women." Rebecca finished his sentence with a hint of resignation, understanding the unspoken truth behind his words. The silence on the other end confirmed it. She sighed and traced her finger along the rim of her coffee mug. The regional championship was coming up in just a month, and she needed to practice on a proper range with measured distances. Their back 40 acres just weren't enough anymore. Her father chuckled softly, knowing well how determined his daughter was. "You've always been the determined one." After hanging up, Rebecca walked over to the old oak cabinet in the corner of the living room. With a soft click, the lock opened, revealing her grandfather's rifle. It was a classic bolt-action, carefully maintained and upgraded over the years. Not flashy or modern, but devastatingly accurate in skilled hands. She ran her fingers along the smooth, worn wooden stock, feeling the history behind it. This wasn't just a gun. It was a part of her heritage. Her grandfather had taught her father, and her father had passed the knowledge to her, along with the respect that came with it. "A good shot isn't about strength," her grandfather used to say. "It's about patience, breathing, and knowing exactly who you are when you squeeze that trigger." She carefully placed the rifle in its case, alongside her spotting scope and ammunition. Rounds she had loaded herself, each one crafted with care after long early mornings and late nights at the veterinary clinic where she worked. Checking the time on an old watch that had belonged to her mother, Rebecca knew she had to leave if she wanted to get to the range on time. She slipped on her olive green jacket over a simple white t-shirt and took one last look at herself in the hallway mirror. No makeup, no show, just Rebecca Porter, 5th-generation hunter, veterinarian, and unassuming markswoman. She didn't look like the competitive shooters featured in magazines, with their logo-covered gear and expensive custom rifles, but she didn't need to. Her phone buzzed with a text from her brother. "Show them what a Porter can do, but don't show off too much or Dad will never stop bragging." She smiled, typing back, "No promises." Loading her gear into her well-worn pickup truck, she felt a flutter of nervousness. Not about shooting, she never worried about that, but about entering a world where she knew she would be judged before she even fired a shot. "Just focus on the target," she told herself, starting the engine. Nothing else mattered when it was just her, the rifle, and the bullseye. The shooting range stretched out before Rebecca, a wide-open space surrounded by gentle hills that acted as natural backstops. Rows of expensive vehicles, gleaming trucks, and SUVs with custom paint jobs lined the parking lot. Her own pickup, practical and mud-spattered, looked out of place among them, like a dandelion in a rose garden. The main clubhouse was impressive, stone and timber with large windows overlooking the range. Inside, trophies gleamed, mounted game heads stared down, and photos of past champions hung on the walls. Almost every single one was a man. Rebecca approached the registration desk with steady steps. The attendant barely glanced up from his computer. "Membership card?" he asked flatly. "I'm not a member," she replied simply. "Just looking to use the long-range targets for the day." His eyes flicked over her worn jeans and plain jacket. "Day pass is $75. You'll need to sign a waiver," he said, his tone skeptical, like he wasn't sure she could afford it. Rebecca handed over her credit card without a word. She'd been saving for this moment. "You know, the long-range area is for experienced shooters," he added. "The beginner range is over there." He pointed toward a smaller, less equipped section. "I'm familiar with firearms, thank you," Rebecca said firmly, signing the form. With her pass clipped to her jacket, she walked across the manicured grounds to the long-range section. She could feel eyes on her, curious, doubtful. She carried her grandfather's rifle case and a small backpack of supplies. The long-range area was quieter, less crowded but no less intimidating. 6 shooting stations stretched out before her. 3 were occupied by men whose gear probably cost more than her truck. Rebecca chose the station farthest from the others and began setting up. She unfolded her shooting mat, assembled her spotting scope on its tripod, and carefully removed her rifle from its worn leather case. Unlike the glossy, tactical-looking firearms around her, Rebecca's rifle kept its classic appearance, though the barrel, trigger, and scope had been upgraded over the years. She pulled out a well-used notebook filled with notes on distance, wind, and ammunition performance. The kind of details most of the other shooters didn't bother with. A voice came from 2 stations down, low and mocking. "Look what wandered in." Rebecca didn't turn. She expected this. Instead, she focused on her preparation, checking the wind flags fluttering at various distances. Another voice joined in. "Someone should tell her this isn't the place for Grandpa's hunting rifle." Laughter followed. The men's voices carried easily across the quiet range. Rebecca recognized the type. Shooters who spent more money on gear than practice, whose knowledge came from forms rather than experience. "Think she's lost?" the voice said. Rebecca ignored them. She loaded her ammunition into a simple leather holder. Let them talk. On the range, results were all that mattered. She slipped on her hearing protection and settled into position, beginning her familiar focusing routine. Slow, steady breathing, visualizing the shot, following the mental checklist she had refined over decades. A shadow fell across her mat. "Hey there," said a man with sponsor patches covering his shooting jacket. He looked down at her with amusement. "I'm Travis. You sure you're in the right place, honey?" Rebecca lowered her hearing protection to rest around her neck. "I'm sure," she said, meeting his gaze without backing down. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This is the long-range section, precision shooting, not exactly beginner-friendly." "I'm aware," Rebecca replied, turning back to her setup. Travis lingered, eyeing her rifle. "That's vintage," he said, heavy with condescension. "What is that, your dad's old hunting rifle?" "Grandfather's," Rebecca corrected calmly. "It's been in the family for generations." A small crowd gathered. 3 other men drifted over, curious about the interaction. They wore similar expensive gear and wore expressions that barely hid their amusement. "Guys, come meet," Travis said, realizing he hadn't asked her name. "Rebecca here is joining us with her grandfather's hunting rifle." The men chuckled. One younger man, with a trimmed beard, shook his head. There's a sporting goods store in town that rents proper precision rifles. Might be worth checking out before you waste your time here. Rebecca checked her scope alignment as if she hadn't heard. She had faced this attitude her entire life. At hunting camps, shooting events, even veterinary school. Men who assumed that because she was a woman, she couldn't understand firearms or marksmanship. "What distance are you planning to shoot?" asked an older man with silver temples. "Starting at 600 yards, then moving to 800 if things go well," Rebecca answered calmly. The men exchanged looks, eyebrows raised. 600 yards with that setup? Travis whistled. "That's ambitious. The hike gets steep after 400, the older man added, not unkindly. Rebecca nodded but said nothing. She wasn't there to argue or convince. She was there to practice. As the men returned to their stations, she heard their murmured bets. $10 says she doesn't hit paper at 400. I'll take that bet and raise 20. She'll give up after 3 shots. Probably just here for Instagram pictures. Rebecca took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. The comments stung, but she had learned long ago that the best response wasn't words, it was results. She focused on her routine, checking her rifle zero at 100 yards, making tiny adjustments and recording them in her notebook. From his station, Travis watched her between shots, curiosity mixing with disbelief. Rebecca spent 30 minutes at the 100-yard target, shooting 5-round groups with steady precision. Her groupings were tight, something the men would have noticed if they had been watching her target instead of her appearance. When she finished warming up, she adjusted her scope for 300 yards and shot another tight group. No one said a word, though she could feel their eyes. After the impressive 300-yard shots, Travis walked over again, trying to sound casual, but clearly sizing her up. "Not bad for 300, he said, as if he was doing her a favor by acknowledging it. But 600 yards? That's a whole different game. The bullet drop, the wind, it all matters. You sure you're ready for that?" Rebecca looked up calmly, her patience thinning but her voice steady. "Thank you for your concern," she replied without hostility. Travis smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just trying to save you some frustration." The afternoon sun beat down hard on the range as Rebecca prepared for the 600-yard shots. She updated her ballistic calculations carefully, taking into account the temperature, humidity, and a slight crosswind. Travis and his friends had clearly given up, pretending to focus on their own shooting. They stood behind their firing line in a loose semicircle, watching her with open skepticism. "This should be good," Travis said loud enough for her to hear. Rebecca adjusted her posture, gripped her rifle firmly, and slowed her breathing as she ran through her mental checklist. Her focus was absolute. "Hey guys," Travis called out. "Maybe we should give her some pointers before she embarrasses herself." His friends burst into laughter. One pulled out his phone, clearly ready to record what he expected to be a humiliating failure. "I bet she doesn't even know how to adjust for windage," said the bearded man, speaking loud enough for Rebecca to hear. She ignored the comments. A slight twitch in her jaw was the only sign they got to her. This was bigger than just her. She thought of the women in her family who had faced the same dismissiveness in male-dominated spaces. She thought of all the times she'd stayed quiet, walked away, let insults slide because it wasn't worth the fight. But this time was different. Travis came over again, standing close enough to cast a shadow across her scope. "No offense, but that antique you're shooting isn't built for this kind of precision work," he said, pointing at the rifle. "The barrel harmonics alone would ruin your grouping, and the trigger assembly is outdated." Rebecca finally looked up at him. "Would you mind stepping back? You're blocking my light." Travis's smile faltered, but he didn't move. "I'm just saying, maybe you should start with something more realistic. 600 yards is where the real shooters separate from hobbyists." "Didn't you hear her?" Travis called to one of his friends. "She needs her light for her Instagram photos." More laughter followed. "Tell you what," Travis said, lowering his voice to what he thought was generous. Hit anywhere on the target at 600 yards, and I'll personally sponsor your membership here. His friends snickered behind him. And if I don't, Rebecca asked, steady, then you admit you're out of your league, pack up your grandfather's hunting rifle, and let the big boys get back to practice. The challenge hung heavy between them. Rebecca knew it was petty. She had nothing to prove. But the stubbornness that ran in her family wouldn't let her back down. One shot, she said simply. Travis blinked, surprised. One shot at 600 yards? That's all I need. His laughter echoed across the range, joined by his friends. One shot. Even the best shooters don't make those claims. Rebecca stayed silent, waiting. All right, Travis said, spreading his hands. One shot it is. But not just anywhere on the target. He turned to his friends. Center ring, or is that too cruel? The silver-haired man pointed downrange. There's an 8-inch gong at 600 yards. Hit that. Travis's eyes lit up. Perfect. Hit the gong with one shot. He was practically giddy. The bearded man stepped forward. And to make it interesting, if you miss, you buy us all around at the clubhouse. Rebecca hesitated for the first time. She hadn't planned this to be a spectacle. She came to practice, to prepare for the championship, not to perform for a crowd of mocking men. For a moment, she thought about packing up and leaving. There would be other ranges, other days. Her father's words echoed in her mind. But then she thought of her grandfather and the lessons about standing your ground. Of her mother, one of the few female hunters decades ago who had faced similar prejudice. She thought of all the times she'd stayed quiet. Maybe this time it was worth the fight. Rebecca looked up at Travis and the expectant crowd. If I hit it, she said carefully, you all spend an hour learning proper shooting form from me. A stunned silence followed before the men burst into laughter again. Deal, Travis said, wiping tears of mirth from his eyes. This is too good. The men stepped back to give her space, still chuckling among themselves. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It was about challenging their whole view. She settled back into position, blocking out everything except her breath, her rifle, and the distant gong. The rifle felt familiar and steady against her shoulder. It had fed her family for generations. It had taught her discipline, patience, and respect. One shot. She had done this thousands of times before. Rebecca began her ritual, shutting out the world as she prepared to squeeze the trigger. The range grew silent as Rebecca settled into her final position. Even Travis and his friends stopped their snickering, their eyes fixed on her with a mix of doubt and anticipation. They were waiting for the embarrassing failure they thought was coming. Rebecca focused on her breathing, slow, steady, controlled. She felt the familiar connection with her rifle, not as a tool but as part of herself. The 8-inch gong hung at 600 yards, a small steel circle against the rolling hills. She ran through her mental checklist one last time. The wind had shifted slightly, 2 miles per hour from the right. The temperature was 72 degrees, with moderate humidity. She adjusted her scope minutely to compensate for these factors, and for bullet drop over that distance. Travis cleared his throat, clearly impatient. Any time this century would be fine. Rebecca didn't respond. She continued her process without rushing. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger as she exhaled halfway, holding the remainder of her breath. The crosshairs settled just off-center on the gong, accounting for wind drift. Time seemed to slow. In that moment, there was no Travis, no audience of doubters. There was only Rebecca, the rifle, and the target. Just as her grandfather had taught her, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked sharply across the range. The recoil rolled through her like a familiar wave. Before the echo faded, a clear, resonant ping rang out downrange, a direct hit. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. The unmistakable sound of lead striking steel silenced everyone. Rebecca calmly ejected the spent casing, set the rifle safety, and sat up. She didn't smile or gloat. She simply reached for her notebook and recorded the shot details. Windage, elevation adjustment, temperature. Travis stood open-mouthed, his sunglasses slipping down his nose. His friends had similar expressions of disbelief. The silver-haired man was the first to recover. Raising his spotting scope, he confirmed what they had all heard. "Center hit," he announced, unable to hide the surprise in his voice. "Dead center." Rebecca began reloading, preparing for her next shot as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if she hadn't just done what many shooters spend years trying to achieve consistently. Travis started to speak but stopped, seemingly lost for words. "That could have been luck," he finally said. Rebecca chambered another round and agreed mildly. "Could have been." Before Travis could respond, she settled back into position, went through her routine, and fired a second shot. Another clear ping echoed across the range. "Jesus Christ," muttered the bearded man. Rebecca fired a third, fourth, and fifth shot. Each one hit the mark with unerring accuracy. 5 shots, 5 hits, all in less than 3 minutes. When she sat up again, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The mockery had turned to stunned respect. The silver-haired man shook his head in disbelief. The young man with the beard had put away his phone, no longer interested in recording a humiliation. Even Travis, once so confident and condescending, stood with his arms crossed, his expression mixed with embarrassment and reluctant admiration. "Who are you?" Travis finally asked. Rebecca began packing up her equipment. "Just someone who learned to shoot before they learned to brag about it," she replied calmly, a new edge in her voice.